Will 2026 mark the end of the West? For me, West is not poetry. It is a working arrangement. It means Americans and Europeans still treat security as shared project, not as separate bargains, and they still have machinery to act together when crisis hits. What makes 2026 dangerous is that this machinery is being pulled in opposite directions. In Washington, foreign policy increasingly framed as deal-making. Who pays, who owes, who can be pressured, and what can be traded for something else. In Europe, leaders still speak language of rules and solidarity, but they also live inside electorates that are tired, poorer than they expected to be, and skeptical that elites tell truth about costs. Ukraine puts this contradiction on table. If US military aid is reduced, the missing part is not only artillery and air defense. It is intelligence and the systems that turn intelligence into battlefield effect. Satellite coverage, signals interception, secure communications, and the constant analytic cadence that lets commanders act fast. European services are competent, but American scale is unique, and it shows in speed, reach, and redundancy. Some cooperation can continue through institutions, even when politics ugly, because bureaucracies have habits and shared procedures, but habits are not infinite. Europe is already reacting, but the gap between announcements and usable capability remains large. Germany is moving faster than it used to in spending and in readiness discussions, even touching the uncomfortable topic of conscription, but it still needs years to rebuild stockpiles and expand production. France talks about autonomy, yet autonomy means industrial depth, energy resilience, and political unity, not only speeches. Britain stays central inside NATO and stays tightly bound to US intelligence relationship because for London that channel is essential. And the quiet test is frozen Russian assets. If Europe is serious about carrying burden, it needs financial tools that match rhetoric, even if legal and market risks are real. This matters because the American argument about why should we pay is not a temporary mood, it is now a political advantage inside US domestic politics. Midterms will reward whoever tells voters they are not being exploited, and that pushes any White House to squeeze allies. At the same time, Europe has grown up under American security umbrella for decades, so even leaders who talk tough often still check if their moves will anger Washington. You can see it in the choreography. Visits to White House, letters, flattery, constant reassurance games, as if Europe cannot speak in full voice unless US nods. NATO leadership tries to keep all this together, sometimes with undignified theatrics, because their job is to prevent alliance from turning into blame festival. But there is hard reality underneath. Europe can buy time with money, yet it cannot buy instant capacity. Air defense production, missile motors, radars, trained crews, secure supply chains, these are multi-year projects. And Russia knows this, which is why it invests in pressure below level of open war. Sabotage, cyber attacks, disinformation, gray zone harassment at sea and in the air, all designed to remind Europe that peace is already diluted. Intelligence chiefs in Europe have been warning their publics that we are somewhere between war and peace, and that warning is not drama, it is description of environment. If America pulls back even partially, Europe will face choice between painful acceleration of rearmament or acceptance of a security order where Russia is rewarded for aggression. That is the first axis of the 2026 test. And notice another irony. Even when Europe tries to step up, it often does it by sending European money to buy American hardware, because that is fastest way to keep Ukraine supplied and also to keep US engaged. It keeps relationship alive, but it also keeps dependency alive. Meanwhile, Washington discovered that critical minerals and rare earths are weapon too. When China hints it can restrict supply, US policy suddenly becomes less confident, and tariffs become bargaining chips, not principles. So West is pulled by three pressures at once: military dependence, industrial dependence, and political resentment. That is why 2026 feels like a decisive year. It will not be gentle. Now at Gaza. Because Gaza is not side story. It is a stressor on Western legitimacy and cohesion. In 2025, it dominated public attention. Then a ceasefire framework appeared, and the topic dropped below headlines. But the underlying questions did not disappear. Phase 2 requires decisions nobody wants to own. Who governs Gaza? Who provides security? Who pays for reconstruction? And what guarantees exist that rebuilding will not be destroyed again? If you are a Gulf state with money, you hesitate to write checks if you think another Israeli operation could happen on short notice. If you are Israel, you hesitate to withdraw further if you believe Hamas can regenerate. And if you are Palestinians, you hear promises, but you live in rubble and insecurity. Israeli domestic politics matters here. Elections and coalition math can keep hardline incentives in place even if one leader changes, because left-wing camp inside Israel is weaker than it used to be, and settlement movement in West Bank has gained momentum over years. That means even a calmer 2026 can still be a year of slow violence. Raids, targeted operations, settlement expansion, sporadic rockets, and a permanent humanitarian emergency that never resolves. Western capitals will argue about language, about recognition, about arms restrictions, and these arguments will expose that Western publics do not agree on what is acceptable, while governments do not agree on what they can afford politically at home. The result is a visible gap between rhetoric and policy, and that gap is corrosive. There is also security spillover. When war footage circulates every day, anger becomes political resource. Most people express it peacefully, but a small minority can be pushed into violence, sometimes as lone actors, sometimes as part of networks. And do not think this is post-ISIS world. In Sahel and West Africa, armed Islamist groups remain active and in some places expand influence, while fragile states suffer coups, coup attempts, and growing zones where government authority is thin. Europe and Britain may say Russia is primary state threat now, and in many ways it is, but counterterrorism never goes away. It just competes for attention and budgets. This is where 2026 becomes uncomfortable for European governments. They must spend more on defense against Russia, spend more on intelligence and policing, and at the same time manage social tension linked to Gaza and to migration. Migration is not only border issue, it is political structure. Every election in Europe now has a central issue that runs through asylum, deportations, courts, and identity. And this can fracture coalitions. If mainstream parties promise strictness and then fail to deliver, they lose trust and outsiders gain. That matters for Ukraine support, because a government that is fighting for survival at home is less willing to take risks abroad. Economics is the constant factor of all this. In the United States, foreign policy often continues unless it costs voters directly. And the biggest direct channel is inflation. If inflation stays around the low twos and oil prices are kept contained, Washington feels freer to threaten allies and rivals, because domestic pain is limited. One reason presidents like close ties with Saudi leadership is simple. Oil supply decisions can shape gasoline prices, and gasoline prices shape elections. If instead markets wobble, the tone changes fast. Many investors look at concentrated tech valuations and the scale of AI spending and ask whether a bubble is forming. Nobody can time a crash, but you do not need a crash to get anger. many young people across West feel locked out of housing and stability. In 2025, we saw youth-driven protests and uprisings in places far from Europe too. A reminder that politics is not only about ideology, it is about dignity and opportunity. When a generation believes it will be poorer than its parents, it becomes impatient with traditional parties, and it becomes receptive to simple stories that blame foreigners, elites, or institutions. This dynamic will shape how long publics tolerate support for Ukraine, how they respond to Gaza, and how they react to any new shock, such as Sudan expanding into neighbors, or a major election that brings Islamist parties closer to power in a key state like Bangladesh. 2026 could look calmer on surface and still be more unstable underneath, because frustration accumulates while governments try to juggle too many crises at once. Now, China. Western conversation about Taiwan often sounds like simple countdown thinking, as if there is a single invasion date and then history starts. The more realistic risk is pressure campaign that changes behavior without dramatic landing. China can impose a blockade or a quarantine framed as customs enforcement. It can disrupt communications. It can intimidate shipping insurers and ports. It can target specific companies with sanctions. And it can keep military pressure constant until what used to be emergency becomes routine. The lesson for West is uncomfortable. Deterrence is not only about tanks and ships. It is about resilience of supply chains and willingness to absorb economic pain. And this is where critical minerals matter. When China signals it can limit rare earth exports, even very aggressive tariff plans suddenly become negotiable, because modern electronics, weapons, and energy systems depend on these inputs. So when people say America chickened out, what they are really seeing is dependency revealed. The deeper contest is energy plus compute. AI data centers are not abstract. They consume enormous electricity and require grid stability, cooling water, and hardware supply. China has been building wind, solar, transmission lines, and industrial capacity at speed, with a state system that can coordinate from policy to construction without endless veto points. That does not make the system morally admirable, it makes it operationally fast. In the US and in many European countries, grid upgrades face local opposition, permitting delays, and fragmented authority. If political leadership also dismisses green energy investment, the gap can widen, because data centers do not care about ideology. They care about megawatts. Tech firms then face a simple problem. They want to scale AI, but they need power, and the grid is not ready. This is why you can see strange combination in US policy. Very hard talk on China, very large military packages for Taiwan, and at the same time a willingness to cut deals with Beijing when supply constraints bite. Competition and cooperation run in parallel, not in sequence. Look at Chinese youth mood and you see another pressure line. Millions of graduates enter labor market every year, and many do not find jobs that match their education. Some end up in delivery work or gig work, not because they love it, but because career paths are crowded. In China, there is a phrase that translates as lying flat, meaning opting out of competition, delaying marriage, delaying children, lowering ambition. In a system where open protest is punished, quiet withdrawal becomes social signal. Automation makes this tension sharper because factories that use more robots can be more competitive and still hire fewer people. The West should not laugh at this, because it is part of a broader global trend. Growth is separating from employment, and AI could accelerate it. If AI replaces white-collar tasks at scale, you can have rising GDP and still have falling sense of opportunity. That can destabilize politics quickly, and it will shape how much patience publics have for foreign commitments, whether in Ukraine, in Middle East, or in Pacific. So, is 2026 the end of West? My judgment is no, but it is the year when you can measure whether West is adapting or just talking. Think of alliance like a bridge. It carries heavy load only if joints are maintained. The joints are boring things: ammunition production, air defense stockpiles, drone and electronic warfare capacity, secure supply of critical minerals, resilient energy grids, and coherent migration policy that does not leave voters feeling deceived. Watch three indicators in 2026. First, does Europe actually expand production and procurement fast enough to cover gaps if US support to Ukraine is reduced, including the intelligence-related pieces that are hardest to replace? Second, does Europe take decisive step on frozen Russian assets and long-term financing for Ukraine, or does it keep postponing? Third, does China begin rehearsing economic strangulation of Taiwan in ways that change shipping behavior and insurance pricing? If these indicators move in wrong direction at same time, then yes, idea of one coherent West becomes very thin. The tough question is simple. When your security depends on partners who question the costs, and your prosperity depends on rivals who can restrict supply, what exactly is your plan for independence? And excuses will not help anyone.